We have the United States as our great protector because we share these fundamental values and this understanding of the world. And my argument would always be, well, that doesn't continue under a second Trump administration that is openly attacking the institutions of American democracies. Where would that leave our shared values? Where would that leave Australia materially, like in terms of just the presence of American Marines, for example, on our soil? And where does it leave us in terms of our values? And that's a conversation I think we just desperately need to have.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economics in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And well, it's finally here. An election year in the United States, that is. It's a pre-election year in Australia, but in November 2024, Americans will go to the polls to elect the president of the most powerful country in the world. But this election is not like any other that has come before. It's not really business as usual, and it will have huge consequences for the United States and the world. Democracy, as United States President Joe Biden has said, is on the ballot.
America, as we begin this election year, we must be clear. Democracy is on the ballot.
Donald Trump could soon be on course to secure the Republican presidential nomination.
Big win for Trump in Iowa. And
Trump's win was very big. He won by 30 percentage points.
We want to thank the great people of Iowa.
But it is a two-person race.
Ron DeSantis' exit was low-key.
I am today suspending my campaign.
Ron DeSantis has dropped out of the presidential race.
Donald Trump is heading to New Hampshire for the Republican primary, where he's expected to trounce Nikki Haley.
The woman he once appointed to the position of UN ambassador, Nikki Haley.
The former UN ambassador is the only Republican hopeful left trying to slow the Trump juggernaut.
Nikki Haley is trying to convince voters she's a safer bet than her former boss.
Chaos follows him.
Polls show Donald Trump far ahead of Nikki Haley in today's New Hampshire primary.
The talk about Donald Trump becoming US president again is getting louder.
It's depressing. It should be a wake-up call.
It is, of course, very, very early in the election cycle. Republican voters have caucused in Iowa, overwhelmingly turning out for Donald Trump. And this week, Republicans and registered independents in New Hampshire have their turn. Though after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis dropped out, it's now really a two-person race between Trump and former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley. Looking at the numbers there, it's possible it will be all but over after only a few weeks. But what does this all mean for the race for the nomination? Are we really looking at a Trump-Biden rematch? How high are the stakes for America? And given how close Australia is to the United States and our AUKUS agreement, what does all of this mean for us? To give us some deeper analysis on the state of democracy in the United States and the implications of all this for us and for the rest of the world, I'm talking to the Australia Institute Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. G'day, Emma.
Hi, Eb. Thanks for having me.
So, Emma, just to kick us off, I'm sure there's a lot of diehard political tragics listening along, but for those who aren't as across US politics as much as you or I might be, can you just tell us a little bit about the nomination process and what happened in Iowa this week to kick us off?
Yeah, sure, Eb. So I guess like a lot of things about American politics, they've chosen very kind of complicated and convoluted way of choosing the nominees for the presidency. So kind of choosing who's going to go up for election. And this process is kind of run on a state level, and the order of the states is kind of very important and fought hard over, and each state does it slightly differently, of course, as well. So Iowa was first up on the primaries and caucusing calendar.
And it's kind of famous for being first up, right? It's kind of the litmus test for, or the starting gun for the presidential elections.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of seen as, won't necessarily decide who wins the nomination contest, but it will kind of whittle down the field to usually the kind of American pundits would say there are 3 tickets out of Iowa. We're in unprecedented territory this year. That's not quite what happened. So in Iowa, Trump faced really the first test of our assumptions, I suppose, about the level of his support within the Republican Party. And it turned out almost exactly as predicted by polls and pundits, which again is pretty rare. But Trump got 51% of the vote, so a very clear majority. And his closest contenders, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and Nikki Haley, his former UN ambassador, came in at second and third with about, like a percentage point in between them. It was a really tiny margin, around 20 and 19%. So that kind of confirmed, I suppose, what we already thought about where candidates stood.
Well, Donald Trump has won the Iowa caucus in landslide victory,
picking up more than 50% of the vote.
We begin in snowy, beautiful New Hampshire, where the clock is ticking.
Polls show Donald Trump far ahead of Nikki Haley in today's New Hampshire primary.
No Republican candidate in modern times has won the first 2 primary season contests.
The state of New Hampshire is next on the primary calendar, and it's a pretty different kind of electoral map, I suppose, to Iowa. So New Hampshire has a much lower population of Christian evangelicals and a more, what we might call like a traditionally conservative Republican base. So more you kind of like Bush senior Republicans as opposed to like Bush junior or Trump Republicans. and so the reason really that DeSantis dropped out before New Hampshire is that his polling numbers were so dismal. He was polling something like 6%, which doesn't even get him to the 10% threshold required to get delegates out of New Hampshire. So he's gone, and this will kind of test, I suppose, Nikki Haley's support amongst independent voters and also kind of rusted on registered Republican voters as well. So Trump's still polling something like 11 percentage points ahead of her, and she will need to do relatively well. That those numbers will need to stick, I think, to maintain her credibility. But as she quite boldly put it last week, it's now a 2-person race.
I'm right. Chaos follows him. And we can't have a country in disarray and a world on fire and go through 4 more years of chaos. We won't survive it. 70% of Americans have said they don't want a Trump-Biden rematch.
Yeah, does she really have a chance? It kind of almost seems like Trump's got it, stitched up already.
Look, I mean, anything can happen in American politics. Like, I don't want to make ironclad predictions, but at this stage, for sure, it is absolutely Trump's to lose. He's polling so far ahead of Haley that it would be really surprising if she did catch him. Not impossible. She certainly could, but at this stage, it doesn't look like she will. I think she's running really as the backup candidate. If Trump does fall over, which, I guess we keep waiting for that to happen and it keeps not happening. But if it does happen, Haley will be there. She'll end up being the presumptive nominee. And I think that's why she still has a lot of money behind her. She's a kind of insurance policy, I suppose, particularly for those rich Republican donors. So I expect that, she will stay in the race, even if she doesn't come that close to him, given how well he's polling.
So when you kind of talk about if Trump falls over, he is facing something like 90 plus felony charges at the moment, as I understand it. So even though he's popular, his candidacy, as you point out, is not kind of without some risk attached to it. So is that why you predict Haley will stay in the race even if she doesn't do as well in New Hampshire, because there has to be kind of someone else on the ticket just in case?
I think so. Like, I honestly think that is kind of the reasoning, at least, as I said, of some of her donors. I think you probably don't go into that kind of race thinking you're going to lose. I think if you're kind of game enough to do it, you expect you can win. So her calculations may be different, but certainly I think she's an insurance policy. It's hard to say how those felony charges and a potential conviction will play out. I think, like I said, we keep kind of expecting Trump to fall over and he keeps not doing it. And what Iowa...
He famously, one time he said, didn't he, I could basically shoot someone and my voters would still love me. It does seem to be the case.
Yep. They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
Yeah, totally. And I think Iowa confirmed that, that was such a wild thing for him to say, that he could, I think he said I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and they'd still love me. And that was like ridiculed at the time, but, has basically been proven right, because as he said we're talking 91 separate felony charges from the Espionage Act. It is a completely wild situation, but I think Iowa kind of confirmed that, he doesn't have support from his rusted on base in spite of all that. He has support because of it. He's weaponized it so effectively and has used and instilled this narrative of persecution so effectively that it's actually kind of helping him with his base, which is not to say that it would have the same effect in a national poll, like outside of the party, where polling does kind of suggest that if he was convicted as opposed to being charged, that would impact how people think about him and may impact voting.
And is that idea, that polling, does that refer just to Republicans, or is that kind of more a concern for the general election?
It's as far as I know, it's both. So there are a number, like significant, not insignificant numbers of Republicans who would reconsider voting for him if he were a convicted criminal. And nationally, those numbers are higher. So in a national poll, that would certainly impact how people think of him. But having said that, the timelines don't match up. So it's unlikely that there will be any convictions before a general election. So, it's possible that it won't affect people's votes at all, even though he's going to be bouncing between, like sometimes literally the day after a big primary vote, he's going to be back in court, or the day before. So how that kind of all plays out logistically and in terms of impacting his vote is unclear. And, Haley and her supporters, I think, are banking on him falling over because of that or because of something else. But, I think pundits have been predicting Trump's downfall since, he made his way down that golden escalator, nearly a decade ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess it does appear like the most likely scenario is a Trump-Biden rematch. Is that how the general election is shaping up?
Yeah, so far, again, anything could happen, but at this stage, it looks like Trump is the presumptive Republican nominee and Biden doesn't have any credible challenges in the Democratic Party, so he will be the nominee. So it looks like it will be a Trump-Biden rematch. And, the prospect of that, I think, is pretty exhausting, and polling suggests that Americans generally are pretty unhappy about facing the same choice this year that they did in 2020. It's not going well.
Yeah.
Democracy is on the ballot. Your freedom is on the ballot. We all know who Donald Trump is. The question we have to answer is, who are we? That's what's at stake. Who are we?
I talked in the intro about that Joe Biden has said democracy is on the ballot. What does he mean by that?
So I think Biden means that quite literally. He framed his campaign for presidency that way, that Trump is a threat to the kind of foundational values of the United States. One of his kind of catchphrases, that's not a good way of describing it, but one of his lines in the last election was that this is a battle for the soul of America. And he means that genuinely, and he means it because of, quite obvious things like the insurrection of January 6th that was incited by Donald Trump and for which he is facing a number of felony charges. But he also means it because of what Trump has said, really. Like, Trump has told Americans that he plans to catastrophically undermine the institutions of American democracy. He and his campaign team have a big plan, really, for how they're going to do that, for how they're going to essentially enact retribution against who they see as their enemies. be that by kind of clearing out the independent public service and replacing it with Trump loyalists, kind of regardless of experience or expertise. Loyalty will be the big test. And he has done things like literal lines out of the fascist playbook around, calling his enemies vermin, talking about how immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. Like, these are direct quotes. And again, they're straight out of the fascist playbook. And he did used to, I don't want to say pretend, but he would kind of hide behind winks and nudges when he was using this kind of language. Listeners might remember, during one of the presidential debates in the last election cycle, he was asked to condemn white supremacist organisations like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. And he responded with something, I will get the exact quote wrong, but it was something like "stand back and stand by." And that was kind of coded enough that you could have analysts and pundits kind of saying, oh, what did he really mean by that? Like, surely he wasn't really calling out to white supremacists. But he's not even doing that anymore. He's kind of not even bothering to hide behind any of that kind of coded language. And so this idea that democracy is directly threatened by Trump, I think is entirely valid. And Biden is really attempting to frame the whole election around this again being a battle for the soul of America.
And is that going to be enough? I mean, Biden did defeat Trump last time around. That was after, Trump being in office for his first term. So he's not out of the public eye, but he hasn't been in the presidency or in politics necessarily. We're quite far away even from the January 6th insurrection. And things aren't necessarily going very well for Biden and his base at the moment. So how vulnerable is Biden, do you think?
Look, I think he's really vulnerable. And it is, again, one of the many wild things about this year is that we are kind of even having this conversation about whether a message about the potential downfall of American democracy will cut through with voters, like it's any other policy question. But this is the reality of the situation.
I shouldn't laugh. It's really alarming. Yeah.
But I think it's either laugh or cry. Like, those are the two options, maybe both at once. So Biden will continue to prosecute this message, and whether it cuts through, I think, is really hard to judge. And certainly there's a sense amongst American kind of political analysts that it might not be cutting through, like given the pressures of cost of living crisis in the United States, which is pretty acute, and given, two catastrophic wars that the United States has pretty significant stakes in, given the number of other crises that we could mention, is this going to be what motivates voters when they're also indicating that they're pretty tired of Biden himself, that they kind of do want fresh leadership in the Democratic Party. And so Biden is really facing this uphill battle. But I think we should be really careful about making predictions about how voters are going to receive that, because, in the both in the 2020 presidential election and the 2022 midterms, there were similar conversations about whether, Americans would turn out for democracy. And both times, really, they have. In 2022, especially in the midterms, there was an assumption that, because Biden was the incumbent and historically midterms usually go to the opposition party, that there would be this wave of votes for the Republican Party, like a red wave. And that just didn't materialise. And that, voters were telling us that was because they were deeply concerned about the state of American democracy, and also mobilised in a pretty directly related way, I think, by issues like reproductive rights for women, where those rights are being catastrophically undermined by an unrepresentative Supreme Court of the United States that Trump had stacked with conservative judges, and which was making a decision that goes directly against what the vast majority of Americans say that they want. So, those two issues, I think, are directly related in that they contribute to a sense that American democracy is just not functioning, that it is a kind of tyranny of the minority on the majority. And so I think it's entirely possible that people will be motivated to turn out to vote. And of course, turnout when you don't have compulsory voting is critical. But that especially,
crucial.
yeah, it's absolutely. And more so, I think, you mentioned at the start, Eb, that this is an election unlike any other. I think turnout it's always critically important, but it will be even more important this time around, because when you kind of look at the nature of the US electoral system, there are only really a couple of states that will probably be in play when it comes to winning the electoral college, which is how a president is elected. They're not elected by popular vote. And I think given the kind of volatility and the violence that we know Donald Trump is willing to, encourage, like he relishes the idea of political violence, a close election result, if it's coming down to a couple of thousand votes in a couple of swing states, is potentially catastrophic, because, we know Trump's not going to accept a loss. Like he's already said that quite openly. And so Biden, I think, doesn't need to just win. He needs to win really clearly by a lot.
Really convincingly.
Yeah, exactly. Which is not, I know this sounds really like I am catastrophizing, but I think just given the kind of volatility that we're dealing with, that will be really critical to Biden, which is not to say that, violence or further discord is inevitable. But I think, if it happened tomorrow and it came down to a couple of states, the likelihood of things degenerating further is pretty high. And so that turnout for Biden is critical. And there are pretty worrying signs for that. As much as I've said, of course, it's really hard to predict. But Biden, I think, is really suffering on a number of fronts.
2/3 of the people who voted don't think President Biden was legitimately elected.
Nervous about Biden's personal fragility.
He's not electable.
We're going to defeat crooked Joe Biden, and we are going to, in fact, make America great again.
His big pitch in 2020 was that he was a unifying candidate for the Democrats, that he could bring the young voters who had campaigned for Bernie Sanders along. He could bring kind of the older cohort of Black Democratic voters who are, more conservative than young white progressives, for example. Like he could unite this coalition of voters and get them all to turn out for him, that, he is the kind of grandpa loving, unifying figure. That was his promise, and he came through with that. But he also promised to be a bridge. When he was asked about, in 2020, asked about his age and all the kind of young, diverse candidates that he was defeating, he talked about his role as being a bridge to the next generation of leadership. And I think the fact that he hasn't really done that, there aren't kind of young people waiting in the wings to take over. He hasn't stood aside for a younger candidate. He hasn't made way. And, we can talk about the reasons why he hasn't done that. But the fact is he hasn't. And I think a lot of young voters are disillusioned by that. They're disillusioned by what they see as him not doing enough on climate change. He passed some really important legislation early on, the really important climate legislation in the Inflation Reduction Act. But there hasn't really been much since then, and he's been pretty busy doing things like approving new gas exploration and gas wells off the coast of the United States. And there's also, of course, and we've talked about this before, there's Gaza and, what many young people and progressive voters see as a shocking lack of action and compassion on his part. The way that all those issues are coalescing around Biden and kind of a political disengagement and frustration is, again, really hard to predict, but it's not, I don't think it's good for Biden, is a lighter way of putting it, I suppose.
Yeah, because if you're relying on turnout, as you said, people motivated to kind of be there to defeat Trump, gets harder and harder the more reasons they have, obviously, to not turn out if, the Democrats are relying on that base.
Exactly.
Foreigners are panicking about what might happen in November.
As our national leader, are you relaxed either way on the outcome of what happens in November in the United States? Could you work with Donald Trump?
We'll work with whatever the outcome is, because the relationship between Australia and the United States is not just a relationship between individuals or leaders. It's a relationship between our people, and the United States is a nation of which we have no closer ally.
We've talked about democracy being on the ballot and some of the risks associated with another Trump presidency. So I guess I wanted to talk about that idea of democracy being at stake and what that means for an ally like Australia.
Yeah, sure. So this is something, as you know, I think about a lot, just given the incredible stakes of this election and given our closeness to the United States, because I think there are so many questions left unanswered by the Trump era, by the first Trump administration and Australia's relationship with that government. You know, that a lot of presumably kind of the AUKUS deal was pursued while Trump was still in power. A lot of that thinking happened while he was in power. And there was an ideological closeness, I think, between the Morrison government and the Trump administration that got downplayed. You know, it was kind of suggested that it was pragmatic, that it was necessary for Australian security, but there was quite clearly an ideological affiliation. And I don't think we've really grappled with that. And we're now faced with a situation where we may see it again, only in a situation where we're actually even more closely tied to the United States than we were 4 years ago through the AUKUS deal, but also just generally through kind of increasing what defence would call, and kind of international relations types call, interoperability and interchangeability between the Australian and US militaries and defence forces. And so, you know, I think it's a really open question about what all of this means for Australia and our relationship with the United States, because we're constantly told that all of this, you know, all of this interoperability, all of our kind of extreme closeness with the United States is for our own security, but that it's also, that is all based on shared values. You know, we have the United States as our great protector because we share these fundamental values and this understanding of the world. And my argument would always be, well, you know, that doesn't continue under a Trump administration, that is a second Trump administration that is openly attacking the institutions of American democracies and imposing the kind of tyranny of the minority onto the majority of American people. Like, where would that leave our shared values? Where would that leave Australia materially, like in terms of just the presence of American Marines, for example, on our soil? And where does it leave us in terms of our values? And that's a conversation I think we just desperately need to have, and we need to really stop kind of seeing the alliance as this untouchable thing that's unrelated to developments in domestic politics on either side of the Pacific, because it's deeply and inextricably related to what happens in the United States. And I think we really should be preparing for bad outcomes in the United States. Like, that's what any good foreign policy does, is it prepares for catastrophe, even unlikely ones. And, you know, I suppose from my perspective, it's not obvious that those conversations are even happening anywhere. And part of the big problem, I think, with foreign policy in this country is that we don't have open conversations about it. You know, it's such a closed shop in terms of who gets to decide. And AUKUS is kind of the epitome of that. You know, it's something that we heard about like at 11 p.m. the night before, and then we had no open discussion about.
Yeah.
We really need to be asking ourselves those uncomfortable questions, and not, you know, I don't think talking about abandoning the United States, but talking about how we actually live our shared values with the United States. Like, what does democratic solidarity, as opposed to just kind of blind security solidarity, what does that look like? What's the difference? And I think the differences are pretty big. So it's like, it's messy and it's uncomfortable, but I think we need to have those conversations, and we need to have them really soon, because the closer it gets to November, the closer it gets to a potential return of Trump, the harder it is to respond and the less room we have to move.
And are there things, like you say, we need to have a conversation, but like in a worst case scenario, which, as you said, you know, we should, should always be prepared for. I mean, what are some of the things that Australia should be thinking about now? in terms of, a potential breakdown of some of the democratic institutions there, I guess.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a really, again, like it's a totally wild scenario to contemplate, but here we are. And I think as I said, I think we should be thinking really hard about this. So for me, I think it's really thinking about how we flip the relationship so that security doesn't trump everything else. But so security is not like the primary concern, and that actually democratic solidarity is what we're talking about. And so practically that means things like elevating things that already exist. So we already have parliamentary exchange and congressional exchange with the United States, but it means elevating those democratic relationships with democratically elected representatives over and above kind of closed shop, really often quite actually anti-democratic relationships between unelected defence officials, which is often how the relationship is managed now. And so it's opening up the relationship to scrutiny and democratic accountability in a way that it just hasn't been before. And that means, greater scrutiny on deals like the AUKUS submarine deal and the strategic considerations behind that, whatever they may be. And opening them up to democratic conversations and democratic accountability rather than just foisting them upon people and assuming that, foreign policy, it kind of sits above democratic accountability. And I know that kind of sound like it is esoteric, but and messy. And I think we just kind of need to embrace that and kind of really have foreign policy in that relationship in the mix of policy that has an influence on how people vote, how people kind of talk to their representatives, rather than just something that's kind of sits above and doesn't have any accountability. And that can also mean like elevating cultural exchange and elevating the kind of fun things that we share with the United States and things that we are really proud of, like solidarity in kind of opposing the worst excesses of human rights abuses in the world. So Australia has the Australian people, as opposed to the Australian government, have a really long history of democratic solidarity with Americans campaigning, against things like apartheid in South Africa or campaigning for environmental protection. And so I think it's elevating those relationships and those exchanges above a defence relationship that assumes always that conflict and war is inevitable when it isn't.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. That's quite a lot for me to sit and think about and for listeners to kind of dig into, Emma, and I'm sure we'll talk again through the rest of the year because, as you mentioned, this US presidential election has a long way to go and there's a lot of implications for Australia. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Eb. It's going to be a big year.
Understatement, I think. This episode was recorded on January the 23rd and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. You can find me at Ebony_Bennett with a _NTT. Emma is at Emma Shortis. And our producer, Jennifer Macy, is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.